Joining us now is Alnoor Ladha. He's the executive director of the Rules, a global anti-poverty hub and organization. Alnoor, how are you?
Great, Michael. Thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure to talk to you as always, man. So I want to talk. We're going to get to this really, really interesting set of actions that you guys have planned for Friday, sort of in protesting, not just protesting the World Bank, but really outlining a different kind of global vision of how the economy and how society can and should work. But I want to situate where you're coming from before we get there. So the rules is, I mean, it is an anti-poverty organization, as I said in your intro, but you're looking at things a little bit more fundamentally and a little bit more systemically than we might be used to when we hear the term anti-poverty organization. So explain what the rules, what you guys are doing, and what the context you're operating under, and how that kind of sets the stage for the actions on Friday.
Yeah, cool. It's a great question. Start big, and then we can get into the details.
Right.
We don't even really think of ourselves as an anti-poverty organization in any traditional sense. We think of it as how do we address the root causes of inequality.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens in the sort of traditional poverty development rhetoric is that they try to separate poverty and inequality. They like to talk about poverty as if it's an end state, some sort of externality that is solvable. But it's not. Poverty is not an end state. It's impoverishment. It's a process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's created and ratified every day by our social, political, economic system. And that's done quite purposefully, and not in the sense of a conspiracy theory, but in the sense of it is the natural, logical outcome of a set of rules that benefits the top 1% to the detriment of everyone else. And so trade rules and land right rules and rules around climate change that allow rich companies to pollute and spew carbon into the atmosphere, all of these sort of major structures create poverty. And the thing with inequality, and the reason that even progressive movements don't like to talk about inequality, one could argue they're not progressive if that's the case, but inequality is a relative thing, and then all of a sudden you need to talk about sort of how society should be distributed and what is fair, and they just want to sort of categorize it as this other thing that can just be solved by more money, raise all boats, all of those old kind of neoliberal tropes.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating. So when you talk about the rules, what you're really getting at is, and in some respects, I mean, obviously there are these very objective conditions that we live under. There's different economic rules, there's technological realities, but at the same time, capitalism is a story, as any other kind of large organizing system. We're living by stories and narratives that we take as, conditioned objective reality. This is the system we live under. 2 + 2 = 4. That's just it. And we need to navigate around that period, even if it's not sort of really working. And I think so. Is that the other part of what you're getting at? There's like the objective process of challenging the policies, but you're using that as a kind of road to question the underlying stories or rules that we're living by, and then in that create space for new ones.
Yeah, that's our highest ideal in many ways. Part of the challenge right now is that we have people who are on a daily basis, and the world's majority. I would say 7 out of 8 people are living under $10 a day and directly affected, by the policies of sort of rich Western governments. And their only strategy for growth is what they call emerging economies, and it's really about the exploitation of the rest of the world, because the West has stopped growing, and even through a sort of credit-based economy, there are limits to that. And so you have to stop the bleeding to a certain extent. But we can't only focus on the kind of reactionary, here's what the World Bank is doing or the IMF is doing, and that's important, as we'll talk about when we get into this campaign. But the reason to do that is also to build power amongst us, to build connections and relationships among progressive / radical social movements around the world, because that's where the power is. And the aim eventually is to then use this power base that's been successful. Just look at what the movement has done since even the 1960s, right? If you think about from civil rights to the feminist movement, to bring it to now to Occupy or Arab Spring and Chilean Winter and Idle No More movement, all of these, there's just been this like exponential rise in the frequency and power and interaction and dynamism of the challenge to power. And so we have to continue to do that. We have to, stop the bleeding. We can't just be in that sort of futuristic utopian, what does the regenerative society look like, or what does the new economy look like, and sort of forget about the rest. The two have to happen together, and actually they're totally symbiotic. Because as we challenge power, we build our own power, and that starts giving us the avenue to then say, okay, what if we're okay with having some kind of ownership capitalist structure if they're cooperatively owned and we have checks and balances on these corporations, and then as we get those sort of wins, and then we talk about how do we move away from a debt-based economy, but we can't even begin to have those conversations when power is concentrated the way it is.
Right, and we're going to get to the World Bank specifically in just a moment, but I thought that was really interesting because you were, obviously starting in the 60s, but then referencing things like Occupy, the movements of 2011, 2012 in the Middle East, Chile, the African awakenings you could add as well. What I'm wondering, because I think in the traditional narrative, what we sort of get fed as an example was, well, Occupy at best, gave... It helped frame the 2012 election potentially, and there was some more broader talk of inequality. The Arab Spring, that's turned to Arab Winter with the kind of growth, disillusion of states and growth of terrorism. But I get the sense from the way you think and how you situate things that even with those countervailing forces and even with those disruptions, that you're still seeing in the longer term, the longer trend, that all of those movements, all of those uprisings are still kind of, they have momentum, even if it's not apparent day to day, and it's still feeding something broader, and that's emerging, that you're pointing to and trying to coordinate in some respects.
No, definitely. I think the defining battle of our time is corporate globalization versus decentralized social movements. The plutocrats versus the people, and this sort of this battle, and I hate to use war metaphor, but it's getting intensified in so many ways that the only outcome is going to be a massive tipping point. And of course, climate change is going to exacerbate that tipping point. Having the highest levels of inequality known to man. We have 89 billionaires with the same wealth as 3.5 billion people.
Right.
Just think about that. You could put these people on a small jetliner, and they have the same wealth as half the human population. These history is very fragile, and the elites that we have in power, we have rewarded. And this is not to just say, this is not about people. It's about a logic of the system. Right. The system has rewarded people that are highly short-termist, highly selfish, highly Machiavellian. That's the rule, the code of the capitalist operating system. And so it's no wonder we have a psychopathic elite. We have to look at these people in power and not see them as people we look up to, but people that we should have empathy for. That in many ways are powerless, and in many ways, like the system itself, the logic of the system doesn't reward merits, right? These aren't intelligent people. They might be clever in certain ways, in Machiavellian ways. They're not wise. And actually, the people that get rewarded by this system are the people who sort of best perpetuate the logic of the system. And that's what these people are. And so they're doing, there's so many diabolical things happening at that global level. So TPP, the global trade deal that's trying to carve up the world and allow corporations to sort of set the rules. Or RED, this UN program, reducing emissions through deforestation. And essentially what it does is it allows corporations to buy massive swaths of land and displace indigenous people and get carbon credits and tax credits in perpetuity.
Right.
Even the whole carbon trading scheme is like, how do we create a long-term infrastructure, multi-generational, supranational, it doesn't matter who's in power, because they're desperate. right? So that's happening on one side, this battle. And then on the other, we're seeing all these beautiful sparks. And now we can look at just one of the sparks and try to, create the sort of post-mortem, let's say, for Occupy or the Arab Spring. But why would we analyze that in a bubble? And, part of the reason we do it is because the way we experience history is very immediate, very short. We're here now. We read these daily newspapers. We're inundated with sort of the sort of crap that passes for news on the internet and
Hey,
in
watch
sort
it.
of the media, right? Yeah, no, but and who is this media largely owned by, right?
Right.
So even though we think we're free and independent thinkers, our subconscious and even our conscious and even in some precognitive and pre-linguistic ways, we are primed with all sorts of messages around sort of defeat and lack of hope. And people like Margaret Thatcher are explicit. There is no alternative. Her famous line, there is no alternative. But we're told that in a myriad of other ways.
Right.
And we face that power in every way. We get denied for a mortgage. Our kids don't get into the school. There's these daily reminders. They're like landmines all around us that tell us that the only way is this, and it's fundamentally untrue. And so, you mentioned the African awakenings, Michael, and there's 30 plus African awakenings happening on the continent. They're small in some cases, large in others. Popular resistance to the dominant neoliberal paradigm, the Western capitalist model that's being exported everywhere, sometimes at gunpoint to their head, whether that's structural adjustment programs or loan conditionalities or investment conditionalities or whatever it is. But there's total resistance to that, and they're all connected, right? And the story we're told by the media, so Arab Spring is about some backwards Arabs taking their hijabs off their women and embracing Western democracy. And that's total bullshit. It started with a self-immolation in protest to economic injustice.
Right.
And all of these struggles, even Idle No More, the global indigenous struggle that started in Canada, these are all about, they're an expression towards a system that does not benefit the world's majority. And
Right.
they're the white blood cells, they're the autoimmune response for a planet that has had psychopaths at its helm for way too long.
And actually, and that's a very important point. I mean, just going very specifically back to Egypt, there's the role of the labor movement in just even specifically like a city like Alexandria, which obviously is not in Cairo, not in Tahrir Square, was absolutely pivotal to the movement in 2011, and that was not nearly as covered as the role of tweeting or something like that. So you're absolutely on point with that. Now let's take this to this World Bank action that you have planned. I remember, maybe I was 15, 16 years old. One of the first kind of serious actions I took part in was a World Bank protest, which was a little while ago now, like 2000, 2001, something like that. The World Bank has always sort of been a center for, a vehicle for kind of imposing the types of policies, obviously, that you're talking about in developing countries and across the globe. Why specifically are you focusing on the World Bank, and what are the actions in WorldVsBank that you are undertaking? And then after that, we can kind of get to, again to the alternatives that you're outlining as well.
Sure, yeah. So, part of this came as a sort of response to what a lot of different groups were coming together around. And so, what we try to do is not go impose our own agenda or put up some, useless petition, but really to respond to the needs of social movements around the world or other, legitimate bodies for the people's voice. And what has happened is that it started very specifically around the World Bank's doing business rankings, which, I don't know how much you know about this.
I've covered that on the show. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. But most people don't know this, that, most people know about the structural adjustment programs, where these kind of, these diabolical set of programs that were really pushed through in the 80s and 90s that devastated the African continent. They were, a set of, essential mandates on how sovereign governments could run themselves. And they were forced to run themselves in ways that sort of emulated not actually the way the U.S. or the U.K. really run themselves, but in ways that benefited U.S. and European corporations. So they had to cut their health care and their welfare systems and all social security.
Privatization, austerity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Privatization, austerity, you know it, right? And, they destroyed the continent. In the 1960s, the African continent, post the various independence movements, was growing at like 4, 5, 6% a year, and then these structural adjustment programs coming in, and the continent was growing at 0.5%, totally directly related. And of course, the West got massively rich on the back of this. And so in about 99, they were essentially forced to stop. Like the widespread legitimacy of the bank was in total question, as was the IMF, and the National Financial Corporation, and of course USAID and all these other organs of neoliberal expansion. And so what happened is they said, okay, we'll take these away. And of course, a couple of years later, in 2002, they rolled out the Doing Business ranking. Sound very benign because they're rankings, and as all the kind of Orwellian tricks that imperialists use, what they did was they essentially created this non-voluntary ranking system that happens by a bunch of technocrats in DC, and they rank every country on the world on how easy is it to fire labor, how easy is it to pollute their environment, what's their relationship with tax havens, how easy is it to extract wealth from that country, and then do these rankings, and then essentially tie their loans or their investment projects or even their involvement in countries onto how willing they are for these reforms. And they don't hide these things. It's the flagship program of the bank. They take great pride in saying that 40% of the reforms on the African continent have happened as a result of these rankings, and it's probably much more.
Right.
And so groups were coming together, and we said, okay, let's reanimate the fight against the bank, because it's sort of languished in the last 10 years or so. They haven't been the target. There's been so many other enemies, and we're like, this is a great moment. And so last March, April, we sort of started this campaign called Our Land, Our Business, working with 230 different social movements and civil society organizations around the world. Put this back on the map as, you haven't taken away the structural adjustments. The new shock doctrine are the Doing Business rankings, and we want the abolition of these rankings. And of course, most people in the group, and anyone who understands power, wants the abolition of the bank itself. But we have to start somewhere, and this is a great entry point, which is it shows how undemocratic, how plutocratic, how elitist, how pro-corporate, and how anti-poor the bank really is. So that's the essential demand of this campaign. And WorldVsBank is basically the doubling up of that effort. It's all of these groups who discussed these things with the bank. They showed their banality of evil in those discussions, and now it's the people are taking it to the streets. So it's going to be 12 cities, simultaneous, what we're calling creative resistance. So poets, spoken word artists, musicians. So it's not angry lefties just protesting. We're showing the sort of beauty of the resistance, and just basically allowing the bank to know that we know the emperor has no clothes. We know that you pretend to be a development organization, and you're really an organ of neoliberal wealth extraction. And so that's one level, is this 12-city simultaneous creative resistance. The second is we're doing a missed call campaign, which allows anybody with a first-generation basic phone, mobile phone, to dial into these local numbers as their petition. So if they don't have internet or a laptop or whatever, which most places in the global south don't, even places like India only have a 12% internet penetration rate. So we're allowing sort of wide-scale, kind of populist, legitimate expression, and we're going to deliver those. We're hoping it'll be 1 million plus calls in 15 to 20 countries. And we're going to deliver those petitions, that voice, to the bank on Friday. And then there's also the Oakland Institute, which is one of the leading land rights think tanks in the world. We're releasing an amazing piece of research, landmark study that's coming out on Friday around the effects of the bank's policies, especially around land and agriculture, how they've enabled widespread land grabbing and the move to monoculture, destroying diversity of food crops, and also the livelihood of smallholder farmers around the world. They played a central role in that. So all of these different elements, coming together at the same time is sort of the first time this type of organizing at this transnational level is happening in a while, and we're just honored to be part of that resurgence.
Absolutely. And before we close, and I'll be following this, and I'm sure everybody listening and watching will be following this really closely. and I'll be writing about this more, in fact, as you know. But it occurs to me that part of, I think, the product of all of this discussion and all of these movements and all of the things that are at stake is it's really about reclaiming and rearticulating commons, whether it's in culture, whether it's in technology, art, environment, that there has to be these spaces that supersede state power or market power, and that are really a broader common heritage. And that's really fundamentally what's not only what's totally under threat, but also a very the kind of basis of a really different way of looking at prioritizing and organizing things. And I think one of the reasons that I have such appreciation and respect for what you're doing is you're enacting that through the rules and through just kind of allowing these movements that already are existing independently and flourishing to connect and see each other.
Thank you for that, Michael. Yeah, and if I think you're totally right in that, and these elites have forgotten, why they're in power in the first place, right? So government rule now is just corporate rule, and they're only in power. They only exist because we allow them to, and their role is to serve our interests, and they fundamentally do the opposite. So I think this is a great moment, and if anyone wants to get involved, go to ourlandourbusiness.org. And always feel free to check out www.therules.org.
Absolutely. Alnoor Ladha, Executive Director of The Rules, and a good friend. Very glad to have you on, Alnoor. Thanks so much, man.
Pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much.
No, I think that this action is going to be really amazing. I'm actually writing a piece for Good that will go up, I think, on Friday about the missed call piece. Missed calls are fascinating because basically what they do is they function like text messages in developing countries. You can use it to kind of, because you don't get charged because nobody picks up. So you can use it as like a code, like I'm going to be there in 5 minutes or I'm running late type of thing. And then in 2011, these Indian anti-corruption activists started using it to register public support for this anti-corruption drive. And then Alnoor and the guys he works with created something called, I think it's called Crowd Ring, that actually helps aggregate these calls, and that's what they're using for the World Bank action. So that's pretty cool.